What's up, nerds? Thank you for tuning in to the High Fantasy Podcast. This is your co-host, Morgan, and today we have another author interview for you. Mr. Ryan Kirk has returned. For those of you who missed our first interview, Ryan Kirk is an author and entrepreneur based out of Minnesota. He is the author of several series, including the well-loved Nightblade series. He is the founder of Waterstone Media and has also worked as an English teacher and nonprofit consultant. His most recent book is The GATE BEYOnd OBLIVION, the first in the series, and it was released for pre-order the day we recorded this interview. Check out the description of this episode for more info on that. We had another fantastic conversation with Ryan, lots of laughs, and we dove into fantasy world building, video games, and anime as vehicles for top-tier fantasy storytelling, the role of families and character arcs, and more. Also, folks, please forgive some of the audio quality in certain areas of the episode. The miracle of Skype interview technology is what it is, but nonetheless, it got us connected with our dear author. There's also a point somewhere in the episode where you can distinctly hear what sounds like a plate being dropped on the floor and breaking, and I think this may be the responsibility of Ryan's adorable daughter, who you can hear at various points, kind of in the background. It's very, very cute. So without any further ado, Mr. Ryan Kirk.
Okay, nice to have you back, Ryan. How have you been? And can you tell us more about your release as well?
Oh, yeah, I've been really, really well. Thanks for having me on. I am really, really excited because I am getting close to releasing a first book in a new series. It is called The GATE BEYOnd OBLIVION, and I think it is some of the most fun I've had writing a story in quite a while. I really, really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah. I think I always like to start with a kind of like a what if. And the what if that really motivated this story is the idea of what if a society was just beginning to discover magic in their world and the ways in which that would influence the growth of the society. And so that development is seen through the eyes of a warrior who's just suffered a devastating defeat and a young woman who is studying to apply to university, and she's very, very academic, very smart, and unsettled in her small town. So through the eyes of those two characters, we get to see the very first tentative steps into this new magical world.
Interesting.
It's very mysterious sounding, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you're usually just thrown into the world with magic already in there. Particularly, is it still following in the epic fantasy tradition, or are you kind of breaking away from that with this one?
Nope, I would say that it definitely still falls under epic fantasy. I think I'm not necessarily sure if it is an original idea. I suspect that it's probably not, and that it's been done by somebody else somewhere.
What idea is original anymore?
But just really exploring that idea that instead of magic being something that is, even mostly understood, instead approaching it from the perspective of being something that is really strange and new and unknown.
In terms of magic, so it sounds like it's something that the characters are ready to kind of explore. And, there's a lot of discussion these days, especially with the types of, TV shows and books that are out there about what the difference is between science and magic. And do you think that your characters will explore the magic in your world in a sort of like almost as if it was a science, like it's a method to kind of realize the world in some way, or is it still kind of a mysterious force?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was initially conceiving of the plot and the what if, one of the guides that I looked to was the development of science and scientific literacy in the Western world. And that evolution of paradigm shift after paradigm shift that has given us the advances that we now take for granted. And I thought it was a really useful parallel, because in so many ways it seems like magic can have the same effects on society that scientific discovery can.
Oh, yes.
And it's just a different mechanism that the development happens through. But it seems to me that the development is very similar. And so it was really fun to actually think of the fits and starts and crawling development of science as a parallel for the development of magic in this world.
Yeah.
That's such a fascinating way to look at it, because, we've looked at recent sort of explorations of hard magic systems versus soft magic systems, and how those two sort of world building mechanisms kind of really inform the kind of story you're telling. So I guess without explaining your plot too much, which kind of system are you using, and is it a bit more of there's laws to this magic, and that really informs the sort of puzzles and mysteries that the characters go through, or is it more like a Lord of the Rings style where Gandalf is just throwing thunderbolts or something?
Yeah. So I guess the real question is, will there be magic textbooks?
Yeah. Will there be?
They certainly do not exist at this point in the story. However, someday, perhaps.
Okay.
But no, I find the question actually to be really fascinating, because I'm sitting here thinking about it. I haven't actually asked that question of myself yet. And I think that what it is that it is a hard magic system that is currently presenting as a soft magic system simply because even the users of the magic don't fully understand how it works and what it's capable of.
See.
Yeah, so it does have that thing where, like a lot of scientific discoveries, there's both known and unknown perils of what the process or substance that they're working with is. I actually saw something recently on YouTube. It was about radiation and how different types of radiation are, relatively harmless, from a microwave or like a smartphone, and then obviously if you go to Chernobyl, you can end up getting sick and dying. And they were talking about how there was a woman, Mary Curie, who ended up dying because of radiation. But it's her exposure and going through all the experimentation and processes that she did ended up basically being the foundation for a lot of nuclear energy and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that it has that quality to it, I think, right? Where magic and science are both kind of dangerous, but also very alluring, and because of what they can potentially be useful for.
Yeah, I liken it to the idea that science operates in the quote unquote real world that we live in, and fantasy in our novels that we write. But in a sense, they're both explanations for why the world operates the way that it does. I find that fascinating that we have incomplete understandings, or we know that something works to a certain degree, but we still can't really explain, name the scientific phenomenon. We still can't really explain consciousness very well.
Right.
And so it was really fun to tackle that same problem where in this fantastic world, you're trying to understand the rules that govern magic and govern the physics, but you don't have a complete understanding of what that is. And so it seems very nebulous and mysterious, and it was a really fun space to be writing in.
In your world, Ryan, is there already sort of science, or is it sort of a pre-medieval dark age kind of world?
It definitely resembles the Middle Ages in a lot of ways. A period of time in which you are beginning to see some of the beginnings of the scientific discoveries that have influenced our world, like utilizing steam for various things, for example, are discoveries that are just being made. But I think one of the areas where I've really been struggling is when you have two avenues to discover the world through, whether that be magic or science, like where do you put your attention as an empire? Do you attach it to this magic that is yet like uncontrollable and unknowable, or do you connect it to more standard practices that anybody could master? And that was actually a question that I wrestled with and had a lot of fun with, because you even see in the story, a small example is some of the buildings are built using an elemental affinity with stone. And they're considered buildings of a different quality, of a higher quality than what the common person could live in. But there's also nothing that says that regular masons couldn't eventually learn those same techniques just without the aid of magic.
Right. It's like having Apple instead of Dell or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or imagine somebody having when the first smartphone came out and everyone else has, you know, like at most a flip phone, or they're just still using a landline as their prime. You can tell how old we are now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also another fun kind of thought exercise to be running through, because I think the smartphone is such an excellent example, whereas the intent for it when it was originally designed was really pretty limited. It was mostly just like, maybe you'll be able to browse the internet, make a phone call, and listen to your MP3s at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
But it has by far probably been the invention that has changed all of the world more than anything else in the past decade. And so I think that it's fascinating to see how advances in technology or magic in a fantasy world can have effects that are far more dramatic than even the inventors or discoverers initially suspect.
Indeed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the unintended consequences part is kind of the most interesting thing to me.
Yeah.
It's like if we're doing the analogy between science and magic. And like one of my favorite, I'm just going to bring this up randomly, but one of my favorite films of all time is Jurassic Park. And it's like the classic, like here's mere mortals playing with basically the tools of God and creating dinosaurs for no reason. And then before you know it, big consequences.
Yeah.
And I got a lot out of that, and I think that metaphor is so applicable.
Yeah, I'm fully agree with you. It's one of the reasons why I think fantasy, and sci-fi too, but I think science fiction often has maybe higher standards attached to it in this particular regard. But it's really fun to look at the different ways in which magic may affect a society beyond just driving a plot forward. And when you start thinking about the ripple effects that could be you can lose yourself in them forever, but they're also really fun.
Yeah. Do you find that more readers nowadays are kind of interested in the mechanics of how things are working? Like, there's a lot of blend in genre, and kind of like talking about a hard magic system in an epic fantasy is kind of it might be a novel thing to some people, and perhaps some people don't even think about those kind of things while they're reading necessarily, unless they're like really fantasy nerd buffs. But is that something that you think readers are more interested in hearing about now, like how science and magic are similar and how they operate in fantasy?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's actually two places I want to take that, and that is first, I would say that it seems to me that readers are becoming more discerning about the aspects of novels that they really care about. And so I think ultimately a good story is still going to win over. That's still the thing that's needed more than anything else, and readers will forgive a multitude of sins if the story works for them. But I think that at the same time, I definitely noticed this writing books, for example, that incorporate a lot of martial arts, is I'll get a lot of feedback, both critical and positive, depending on whether or not I got it right, on how martial arts are portrayed in the books.
Right.
And I think that that is a pretty reasonable side effect from having such an abundance of choice these days. 30 years ago, when you only had 15 new releases coming out in a year that you might be interested in, you couldn't quite be as picky. But now that there are every possible subgenre represented by a multitude of authors and books, I think that it makes sense that readers are becoming a little bit more discerning and are picking up on details that they might have been willing to give a pass to a long time ago.
Right.
And so I've definitely observed that, and I enjoy it because it gives me an opportunity to think more deeply about making sure that getting as many details right as I can.
Yeah, it is a pretty fun process. It also brings together communities of very niche topics. Like, you wouldn't necessarily think that martial arts would bring together communities online to talk about different techniques, but there's such a huge sort of fan base and culture around that. So you can exchange information and really, become almost somewhat of an armchair expert about these things, even if you've never really practiced it, or if you have and you've kind of given it up for a sports injury or something.
Absolutely. And I think that there's just so much more information available today, where, going back to martial arts, because it's a world that I dabble in all the time, but you can see online now hundreds of videos of historical martial artists trying to reenact weapon types that never would have come into conflict in actual history.
Right.
But now if you want to see what would a katana versus a longsword look like? You've got 50 different videos up on YouTube with various degrees of proficiency, but you can start to get an idea of what that's like. And I think, readers have access to that same body of knowledge, and so will be able to draw on that as they're reading. And I just think it definitely increases the challenge as an author, but I think that it creates much richer environments in the end.
I know what you mean. It's almost like everyone now is more in the know about everything, and they will know. Yeah, you can't swing a sword like that, or you wouldn't be able to wield it in that manner.
That's what you talk about during Vikings or Last Kingdom.
I mean, Ryan, for all intents and purposes, I am one of these kind of snobs, right, when it comes to certain things.
I am too.
Yeah. Now, Ryan, we'll switch gears a bit, and we talked a little bit about world building, and we gushed about that last time, and
ad infinitum, we probably could, to be honest.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on the role of nature and environment in fantasy?
Yeah, this is something that has actually become more close to my heart as I've gotten older, and something that I have found a little bit surprising. But I grew up in a fairly rural town in North Dakota. Population 3,000, pretty small. And so nature was something that was a huge part of my life growing up that I didn't really think a lot about when I was a kid. But now that I'm an adult and I'm living in a major urban center, nature has become that much more important to me. And so when it comes to my world building, nature often serves as an inspiration for the things that I am trying to create. And in this newest book, one of the things that really, really inspired me was just the basic concept of evolution in nature. and how no species remains the same for a very long period of time.
Yeah.
And I took the approach of considering magic to be a natural force or a natural entity.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that is the case, then it means then magic itself is also evolving as time goes on. So looking at the ways in which species and plants and animals adapt to their environment, I extended that into thinking about how magic might evolve as a world ages.
Yeah, that's so cool. Because
Yeah.
if nature, or if magic is like a natural force, then obviously it would sort of abide to the same laws of evolution. That's so fascinating. Fascinating. That's a word that you use if you're fascinated by fantasy.
Yeah.
And I was thinking last time we also talked about how the world can be a character in itself, and people get really, attached to the world and the environments and the lore of that particular world or setting, like, quite deeply. That's probably one of the first sort of things that people got really attached to in fantasy books is, if you think back to like places like Rivendell or Hogwarts or Winterfell, like people have a deep sort of connection to these places, and it's not always necessarily the characters that do so. It's like the descriptions of that world and how, especially like magic or like mystery is imbibed into imbued into those settings. So that I'm sure that's gonna entrap readers and entice them into reading more.
Yeah, I think that actually Rivendell is such a great parallel to it, because you've got these hobbits who live in like this one world that at first seems very like the world that we live in, and then are abruptly thrust into a world and species that has a history that stretches back so much further and is so much richer than what they are used to.
Right.
And so it's kind of an accurate comparison to the journey that a lot of my characters are taking, where at the beginning of the story they think that the world works in a certain way, and as the story goes on they realize not just that they were wrong, but how wrong they were and how wrong they continue to be.
So Ryan, we recently talked to a friend of ours about anime for a recent podcast episode that we're going to release soon. And as a writer inspired by Japanese culture, how has anime influenced your writing?
Yeah. I don't know if this is quite as true today as maybe it even was a year or two ago, because of the proliferation and the battle between the streaming services willing to push anything out trying to get hits. But if you would have asked me 2 years ago, I would have told you that the very best science fiction and fantasy coming out on television, with potentially the exception of Game of Thrones, was virtually all anime.
100% agree. It's true, though.
And it is. And with anime growing in popularity here in the West, what it has really encouraged me to do is to really just be more bold and experimental in my storytelling. One of the challenges when anime comes over from Japan is that Japan just has a very different culture than the West. And so when shows come over, especially to people who aren't very familiar with anime or Japanese customs, everything seems perhaps even more foreign than they are expecting from an adult animated show.
Right.
But what is always encouraging to me is you can have ideas that on the surface seem absolutely bonkers, but especially in the best anime, they're executed so well that you lose yourself in the world and in the visuals and in the characters. And it has made me realize that there is a market and a hunger for storytelling that definitely pushes against expectations, and I really like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the, as you said, one of the attractions of it is that it's sort of larger than life, and there's situations that don't necessarily happen in the real world, but they still sort of tug at something in us that, you know, it kind of represents something that we've all experienced or have thoughts about, and yeah, it just kind of puts that on like this exponential sort of amazing epic sort of stage. Usually, like if you think of Dragon Ball Z or something like that, there are some animes that are a bit more subtle, but but that's typically I think what I've seen from animes.
You know, the one that I watched a few years ago that just really knocked my socks off was the first season of Psychopaths.
Okay,
I haven't heard of that one, actually.
Highly recommended. The premise, it's a very classic what if story, and it's what if society was run based on scanners reading your emotional states. And so people prone to violent, angry outbursts wouldn't be able to succeed in society. Everybody is encouraged to, you know, fit in and follow social norms. And so the story follows a group of special officers who aren't just culture police, but they're the ones who are trying to solve the most heinous crimes that still happen in this society.
Oh, okay.
So what's really interesting about it is, of course, you've got the exception. They are trying to track a serial killer who is utterly emotionless about their actions.
Oh, okay. So they're not picked up by the scanners.
So the system absolutely cannot pick them up. And in fact, the officers who are trying to pursue the suspect are having stronger emotional reactions and are becoming compromised due to just how horrible the violence being committed is. And so he's actually like turning the department against itself in some ways. And as it goes on, I would highly encourage you to listen to it, so I don't want to give any spoilers, but it also gets into the question of, is such a society beneficial to humanity? And what sacrifices would be made to live in such a culture? It's a superb anime, and I would highly recommend you check it out. Just the first season, stop after that.
Okay.
Doesn't get any better.
Well, the first season tells a completely contained story. It does the whole 26 episode arc or 24 episode arc, whatever it is. And there were all sorts of production issues. There was going to be a movie, and they weren't quite sure about a bunch of different stuff, and so all got kind of screwed up. But just that first season, those first 26 episodes, it's self-contained, and in my opinion, it was a masterpiece that really made me think, and it really pushed me to move my own storytelling farther.
Okay, well, we're definitely going to check it out. We'll have to talk about this next time. We'll compare some notes.
Yeah. But it is interesting, the sort of like idea of a story beneath a story. Do you know what I mean? Like there's the story where, you know, there's these characters going through this conflict and they come to a resolution, but there's also like the understory that the author sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, as we discussed before, kind of like tell through their storytelling. So in this one, in Psychopaths, it's about, you know, like trying to regulate society and how that would actually work or backfire. But then also like the idea of anger, like what is anger? Is it actually bad? Is it a negative thing? Does it always lead to crime? In this case, obviously not, because there's someone who doesn't use anger to commit a crime. So there's all these sort of underlying sort of stories that you start to think about, and then still get entertained by, like amazing action scenes and just, like a romance or whatever the characters go through. So that's always fascinating to me.
I know that anime sometimes gets shortchanged when people are discussing shows and television, but it also seems to me that it is almost the more natural home of like science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction, because it's so hard and in many cases so expensive to bring like a science fiction or a fantasy world to life.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, what, Game of Thrones was costing millions of dollars per episode?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that with animation, as long as you can draw it, it can happen. And to me, it just seems like it's so much more capable of expressing the worlds that so many fantasy authors are creating, that it's a shame that it doesn't get more attention than it does.
Yeah, it definitely is the Mach 5 version of storytelling in that regard.
Yeah, for spectacle, for sure. That and video games, I think.
Well,
Yes,
another thing.
Seriously.
And anime video games are also exploding too. Like there's just so many. And we recently did an episode on Dark Souls 2, and just playing on that idea of how do you bring Asian or specifically Japanese inspired fantasy, and then kind of you reskin it with stuff that's nice for Westerners and that we get. And so that's why it perfectly blends, and I'm going to do another episode on it, but it perfectly blends, in my opinion, that kind of fast combat, lots of dynamic martial stuff, like with how the character moves. And then there's also just certain, like the way you interact with the world and some of the themes. Like it's too much to get into, but it's all that. But then they have, rusty iron swords and medieval European-looking castle environments and stuff. So it's kind of making it where we go, oh yeah, I know what that is. And then, meanwhile, it is a Japanese game, right? Yeah. I forgot where I was going to go with that, but I get so excited when we can tie different things together. But video games are a huge vehicle now as well, I think, for storytelling and for fantasy and sci-fi. And in many ways, I find video games almost more rich, depending on which game it is, obviously, compared to some shows. Like, I started to even play, I bought the Witcher video game trilogy. Very, very fun, and I've been just comparing how I feel kind of playing it versus the show, and just, like, as a gamer, I go, man, like, you're so much more there when you're just in the game. But whereas a show is nice because it's kind of like you can just kind of take it and then you kind of put it away afterwards. You're like, oh yeah, that was fun. Like I had my episode. I took in my story kind of more passively. Whereas with a game, you're actually involved in the creation of, like you are an agent in the world that they've created, and especially in the Witcher series, like there's those different dialogue options, or there's different consequences and plot progression. I want to see what
you have just hit on one of my other new passions, and that is video game storytelling.
Yes.
But I think The Witcher is an excellent example. I will confess that I've so far only played 2. Someday when my daughter goes to school, I'm going to play the rest of them. But what blew me away about The Witcher when I was playing it is, up until then, every multiple choice branching path game that I'd ever played was always like, do you want to save the orphan with diseases, or do you want to kill the ship of senior citizens on the vacation? It was like, do you want to be good or do you want to be evil? They didn't really leave
very two-dimensional.
They didn't really leave a lot of gray.
Yeah.
But what I loved so much about The Witcher was that it put you in morally complex and ambiguous situations with very definite consequences based on your actions. And I just thought it was brilliantly done because, like real life, there was often no ideal solution. There was just whatever you preferred. And as you're saying, being as you are the agent choosing that path, it is so much more impactful than some of even like the best movies and books, simply because you're right there. You're the one who chose that path.
Yeah. Yeah, there is something really satisfying about being there. I'm doing part of my master's thesis on video games and the environment and world building and things like that. So it's right up my alley. But one of the things that's interesting is the concept of mental theater in literature is that, you know, all these things are kind of happening in the theater of your head. But now with gaming, we have that virtual theater where we're actually implementing the theater itself, like in this world that's already pre-made for us and whatever, but you are the actor in it. And like the whole hierarchy thing between media is, you know, obviously kind of false. And it always kind of rankles me when people kind of put, you know, books on a pedestal and then video games are not so much considered, especially for their narratives. Like, I think narratives in video games is such an untapped sort of pool of,
and they're getting so good.
Yeah,
like they're really, really well written a lot of times these days. Like,
yeah. And I think more people are recognizing that, and you know, there's a lot of interest in those things, and obviously the commercial popularity is, you know, trying to prove that, and you know, people are looking at that now. So yeah.
It's a story that makes me seem a little bit foolish, which is probably the reason why I enjoy telling it so much. But to this day, one of the most impactful emotional experiences I've ever had came from playing perhaps one of the silliest games, and that is Halo Reach.
Yeah, okay. Before we even get into this, I know it's the most emotional Halo game. And it's kind of weird to even say those two things in the same, because it's a sci-fi. I mean,
yeah.
Shalini watches me. I still play Halo with my friends online, and it's like endlessly fun. And each version kind of has its own unique quirks and stuff. But anyway, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna cut short there because I can just nerd out on this forever.
Yeah.
Explain how Halo Reach made you cry, Ryan, please.
But like, I think I was in a funk for a week. After playing that game. And I mean, on the surface, it's just a super well polished, you know, Bungie exited with fantastic force. They put everything together into a pretty nice package. But like, at the end of the day, the story is you need to go kill a bunch of aliens that are overrunning your planet. And you just see your teammates picked off like one by one as the story progresses. But the part that got me was that final scene where, you know, you provide support so the Master Chief and everybody can escape from Reach. And then the screen opens up again and you're just by yourself on this abandoned base. And there's no, like, objective markers. There's nothing to do.
Oh. And
then you just start getting attacked by a few enemies. Just like, one here, one there. You kill them pretty easily. You're wandering around. You're like, I'm sure there's an objective somewhere. It just hasn't shown up yet. And you're going, and you're going, and you're going. And the enemies become stronger and stronger. And then you realize that your shields aren't coming back. And, I mean, you know where this is going. Like, then your faceplate gets cracked. And you're like, I remember it was when faceplate got cracked that I was like, oh, crap. I'm going to die. Like, I'm going to die, and that's going to be the end of the game. And sure enough, it was. But I just remember, like, my stomach just dropped out of my body when that moment hit. And again, like, there's a part of me that looks back on it and is like, I was playing a first-person shooter. Like, I've died 1,500 times to get to that point.
Right.
But that single moment, which was just balanced so well between cutscenes and just, like, the lack of navigation, the lack of purpose, and the gradually increasing enemies, it just floored me. I wasn't expecting it at all. I mean, I might have been a little bit inebriated, so my reasoning might not have been at 100%. But, like, it just hit me so hard. And it's a first-person shooter. Like, it's not even one of the AAA RPG games with, 16 hours of branching paths. It was just a first-person shooter with one ending. But because I was that character by that point, it floored me. And I still laugh about it today, but it is very true.
Yeah, and one big element with that was Halo's soundtrack is just fantastic. It's in my opinion, one of the best soundtracks of any video game franchise, and it's just that melancholic yet very hopeful, and they have that throughout the entire thing.
It's kind of incredible, and thinking about how, when you take out mechanics of the gameplay, like the objectives and, your comrades and things like that, and how that, when it's unexpected, it kind of pulls the rug out of below your feet, and you're kind of just left like, oh, what's happening? And you kind of just get stuck with the emotions of, this is not what you expect. And that, that can happen in books as well, with plot twists about like how the magic system actually operates, or the villain actually being good, or whatever it is. But that sort of like flip of the mechanics, or using your the system, the user interface of whatever medium you're using to kind of create that very like emotional response from the consumer is very interesting. But that's an incredible story, Ryan, even though it's kind of funny, but it's such a...
Oh, it's hilarious.
Yeah.
I laugh at it. My wife is like, you are so weird. I know, but it happened.
No, that's incredible. Speaking of emotional things and things that make us, see the world differently, you mentioned to us recently that your daughter has inspired you to think more about family and think differently about your writing. So how has having a family changed you as a writer?
Oh man, having a daughter has just changed everything, and it sounds cliche. It probably is, but yeah, my perspective has completely changed now that I'm a father. And one challenge that I must now deal with is that every time I encounter any story that has a father-daughter relationship, whether it be healthy, abusive, you name it, like the whole spectrum of father-daughter relationships, complete sucker for it. I'm melting on the floor. Can't even take it. But it has definitely made me more cognizant of the role of family in stories. It is a well-known fantasy trope that if you are a orphan working on a farm in the middle of nowhere, you're probably a long-lost prince.
Yeah.
Or princess, as it may be.
Yeah.
And what I have been interested in exploring, and it probably comes up more in this book than anything else that I've written yet, but trying to write epic fantasy stories with healthy family relationships. No orphans, no my parents sold me to market for money or any of that sort of thing. And the second main character that I wrote, Elena, the student who's studying for university, like she is a member of a happy and healthy family, and it was and I will admit, because I've had a lot of orphans in my stories, that it was really hard to incorporate like a healthy family dynamic and to have one of the children in that family making reasonable decisions in light of like having like a very protective and healthy family. Like why would you go off on a globe-trotting adventure if, you might be discontent at home, but most angsty teenagers aren't going to run away to another country. And so it was really interesting to explore that and to try and express family as a really positive force. And I really, really enjoyed that. I'm excited to explore that even further in future books.
That sounds really cool, and I understand the desire, and I think it reflects in a certain way that you want to be a great dad, and and have a great family. And I mean, I'm not there yet. Like, I'm not a parent, but like, I recently played Assassin's Creed Origins, just to tie in another video game example.
As am I.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good, and
it's very good.
One of the themes is the loss of a child, and I didn't, I'm not a father yet, but I was like, wow, it's just heartbreaking, and it's something that I know nobody ever wants to contemplate. And I think the story handles it very well, and the progression of the character through the grieving process throughout it's kind of like a sub quest, or again, like you mentioned earlier, Shalini, it's like a subplot, if you will. It's incredibly emotional, and one of the big challenges that I've had with one of my favorite series, our favorite series, I guess all three of us, is Game of Thrones. And it's just, to me, when I first started to read and watch it, I was so alienated from how unhealthy the family relationships are, and just to see how like these things become depraved, or when political power is brought into the play, and what that does to people. And it's like, wow, I didn't. It's weird to contemplate how broken these institutions can be, especially when you've come from one that you then realize, wow, like I had a really healthy upbringing compared to this, at least. And it affects us for our whole lives.
And I think it's a tough thing to do in stories, and I really commend you, Ryan, for trying to incorporate more healthy family relationships, because one of the things I'm struggling with as a writer is stories are made by the conflicts in them, and if your character has a really healthy sort of family and background, as you mentioned, it's really hard to kind of create the conflict or the friction necessary to start the story or progress it forward. So in that way, novels are kind of, or stories are kind of limiting in terms of that, in terms of like presenting realistic stories that are not always like about loss or abuse, and sort of topics like that really, pull at people's heartstrings and in a way entertain people, because they're so like fantastic and not out of the ordinary. But kind of going back into, talking a bit more about realistic stuff is an interesting avenue.
Yeah,
I was particularly inspired. Have either of you encountered the Green Bones saga by Fonda Lee?
No.
Jade City and Jade War.
Don't think so.
It is. It's an incredibly unique fantasy world, almost like a 1960s, 1970s ish. Modern day equivalent secondary world, but it's basically if like 1970s kung fu films and classic mob films got together and had a child. So the story, both books focus on one of the ruling gang families of this small island nation. And they earn their power by using Jade to power their essentially magical martial arts abilities. So you get your magic kung fu, but it's also like they've got cars and radios and telephones and all of that. It's absolutely fantastic. It's been up for a lot of awards, and they're all well deserved. But the reason that I bring it up is it is in many ways a family drama, as it focuses on the family relations of this ruling clan. Her ability to bring out the true complexity of family is, I've never encountered its like in fantasy. It is, you can see the love, you can see the anger, you can see the history, and she does it so beautiful. It just feels so absolutely real, even though I've never been part of a ruling gang family of a small island nation. Like, the family dynamics just ring like more true than anything that comes to mind for me in fantasy. And I was really inspired, and someday I hope to pull those dynamics off half as well.
It's such an interesting and undervalued thing, the sort of family archetype, and especially in fantasy, it's not really explored as often as family dramas. So it's a valuable sort of thing to look into.
I guess also another part, like going back to, the Eastern versus Western fantasy, like Western, I think, is way more focused on the individual hero / protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll have, like in Naruto, it's kind of like every character is almost as valuable as the main one in a way. And it's kind of like he has his own funny kind of silly family of in this ensemble cast of ninjas. So
that's actually a really good point. I mean, I'm thinking of like every major long-running anime that I can think of, and that's always true. Like, it's always an ensemble cast. I think of Rurouni Kenshin or Dragon Ball Z. All of those characters get more or less complete arcs depending on how complete the series is, and it's always a group effort.
It is. And even the family unit, or the people who are the family of the main character are highlighted. There's that trope in anime of like the mom who always dies, but like at some point. But like beyond that, like there are always some sort of influence on the characters, and they often they do have a physical presence that perhaps, as you say, Morgan, like is not as emphasized in Western fantasy. So that is a cool place to draw inspiration from.
Yeah,
I think it's safe to say, in general, you do not want to be a mother trapped in an epic fantasy.
Yeah, it's a heavy job.
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking most of the time. So yeah.
I mean, I feel like, at least coming from my own perspective, like when I was first starting to write fantasy, like based on the adventures and the stories that I wanted to tell, like a family was more of an inconvenience than anything else. And so it's like, well, let's just get rid of it, and then we don't have to worry about it, which I think is one of the reasons why like orphans is such a popular trope.
So characters can make their own decisions.
Yeah, then you like just don't need to like worry about the family aspect, or especially if you're doing a chosen one trope. Obviously Orphan is the like ideal rags to chosen one story, so it's easy to see how those have developed, but it's fun and challenging to try and push against that and to try and tell epic families or epic fantasy stories that have those strong family connections still.
Who knows? I mean, maybe you'll become a trendsetter where it will be a new part of fantasy that family is just a very important thing, or characters don't always have families that either are terrible or end up being wiped out, and then that's why they become important to us as a character. Like maybe it'll be, this character had XYZ variables in their familial upbringing, and they turned out fine, but hey, they still have challenges, and they have to go through a fantasy story arc. So I'm really interested to see how this will turn out, because it's untapped.
Yeah,
I feel like it almost ties in a little bit to our discussion earlier about readers maybe being a little bit more discerning. I think that readers are just open to so much more, and with so much more being published, and readers are just becoming more literate and more aware of tropes and everything, and so I think they're more willing to accept all sorts of different varieties of characters and backstories, and it's a really exciting time to be a writer and being able to play in that sandbox.
For sure.
So do we want to get into dragons?
Yeah. You know what? Let's hold off on the dragons for another day. It would be a fun discussion, but this one has already been fun, and daughter's patience is nearing its end.
Yes, it's very cute that, as we're talking about family and your daughter, she's, chiming in alongside you in the background. Very adorable.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's been building puzzles while I've been talking, so it's been very nice of her.
Aw, that's very sweet.
That's very patient. Yeah, definitely very. Yeah.
All right, then we'll let you go and enjoy some time with your daughter then. And wrap this up.
Thank you so much for coming on again, Ryan. It's been great to do another podcast with you, and definitely we want to have you back in future, and we're going to talk more about video games and family and other fun stuff.
And dragons.
And maybe dragons. Yeah, we'll see. Dragons.
Maybe you guys can offer me some guidance, because I'm debating whether or not to be adding dragons to the second story, and I'm just not sure.
Interesting.
So
I do have some thoughts on dragons as well, but yeah, maybe we can.
Okay, well then we're going to need to have another conversation so that we can figure that one out together.
Definitely. Sure. Again, thank you for coming on. What can fans expect to hear from you in the near future regarding any of your projects or appearances?
Well, the big news is the GATE Beyond Oblivion will be releasing March 18th. I am very, very excited about that, and yeah, it looks like the rest of 2020 and probably a little bit beyond is going to be spent in the writing of that series. It is a world that continues to get bigger and more complex, and so that is where readers will be able to find me for the foreseeable future.
Awesome.
Yeah, right. That's very exciting, and again, best of luck, and we can't wait to hear more about it.
Yeah, thanks again for the conversation. As always, you guys I think are maybe my favorite podcast to be on. You guys are super fun.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a great compliment, and you as well, Ryan. It's wonderful to speak with you, and we'll talk soon. Have a great day.
Sounds good. Take it easy.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Check out the description of this video, and you can see the different platforms we put our content on, as well as our social media links. Thanks again, and see you next time.